What's the last thing that goes through your mind when you're shot in the head? Well, apart from the bullet, we're breaking down what happens in those final moments, how the brain reacts, what you might feel, and why Hollywood gets it wrong. Let's say you're standing just a few feet from someone with a gun pointed squarely at your head. Maybe it's a mob hitman, maybe a bitter ex, or maybe just a violent psychopath who left their tinfoil hat at home. The reason doesn't matter. What does matter is that their aim is solid and their range is close, and there is no chance that they're going to miss. The second that trigger is squeezed before the bullet has ever left the gun and entered your squishy, soft brain, there's already a whole lot going on. Inside the chamber of that gun sits a cartridge, what most people wrongly call a bullet. The bullet is the projectile at the tip. The rest is the cartridge casing packed with propellant and sealed with a primer at the base. So, the gun is loaded and cocked, the firing pin is held back under spring tension, resting right behind the cartridge, and now, with one final pull, it's released. The firing pin snaps forward, punching the primer at the base of the cartridge, and that tiny impact causes a spark, igniting the chemical powder inside and creating an instant explosion within the cartridge. The propellant chemicals burn and generate a lot of expanding gas very, very quickly, causing a massive buildup of pressure. Being bottled up in such a small place means there is only really one direction all that pressure can travel, outwards. And the bullet cartridges are designed to channel the pressure from that mini explosion and all that kinetic energy that it causes directly behind the bullet. The bullet splits off from the end of the cartridge and is sent down the barrel at high speeds. Most bullets are tapered into a point, which helps to reduce air resistance as they come speeding out of the weapon. But that tapered tip is also helpful for allowing the projectile to penetrate wood, metal, or in this case, your head. Now it's important to bear in mind everything that we described so far has all occurred within only a few seconds. It's so fast your brain likely hasn't even had a chance to process half of what's happened. And even more unfortunately for you, that's not the only problem that your brain is going to have today. Whenever we see gunshots on TV, or in movies, or even inflict them on other players in video games, deaths often seem to happen instantaneously. Sometimes you might see a character struck by a bullet and suffering a slow, painful death, and sometimes characters will shrug off bullet wounds, no problem. In real life, those are all possible. Instant death, a slow, agonizing, fatal injury, or surviving. Although, this is in extremely rare cases. But it all comes down to a myriad of factors, and while you might think that a headshot is the fast track to our first instant death option, you would be surprised. And we found a real-world example to prove that too. First among all those factors is down to the specifics. What type of firearm was used, what size and caliber are the bullets it's firing, and then there's the trajectory the bullet was traveling and what angle it entered your body. All of these might seem like small details, but they can all mean the difference between life and death and something arguably worse. And that's because being shot, well, it's all a matter of physics. Assuming we don't know exactly what kind of loadout our shooter is packing, then let's instead focus on the next majorly important factor, the bullet itself. When a bullet is fired and it hits the human body, all the energy behind it is transferred onto you, the unlucky target. Wherever it strikes the body is where that energy is transferred to, and that tapered end means that it's all focused onto a small point. This is what causes direct damage to the body, as that pointed end has enough momentum behind it to not just break the skin, but to penetrate tissue and bone. Now all of that energy is concentrated into pushing the point of that bullet through your head. Let's say you were directly facing the shooter when they fired. That means the bullet is now spinning through the air with enough kinetic energy to break through the skin of your forehead and into the epicranial aponeurosis, the dense fibrous tissue that covers the upper part of your skull. By now, you might be thinking what kind of damage you'd receive from a gunshot to the head. Or rather, you would be if you hadn't just been shot. Well, bullets can damage flesh and organs in a few ways, the first of which coming as a result of a direct hit. This causes the bullet to leave a permanent cavity in whatever its path is, which in this case happens to be you and the contents of your head, namely your brain. So you would likely be on the receiving end of what's known as a TBI, or a traumatic brain injury. In most urban areas across the US, gunshot wounds are a leading cause of TBI. Roughly 12% of all TBIs are linked to firearms, whether from violent assaults or accidental discharges, and gunshot wounds to the head account for about 35% of all TBI-related deaths. But if you are thinking that that means you have a 65% chance of survival, think again. Gunshot wounds to the head are fatal around 90% of the time, with most victims dying on the scene, if not instantly. Though some victims can survive the initial trauma, including one we'll talk about shortly, around half of those survivors will die in the emergency room. So, safe to say your odds of sustaining a traumatic brain injury pretty high, odds of you surviving it not so much. But what exactly causes someone to die from a gunshot wound? A wound where the bullet enters the body, or in your case the cranium, but does not travel far enough to exit, is referred to as a penetrating wound. If a bullet is able to travel fast and far enough through to exit the body, this is called a perforating wound, also known as a through and through. In either instance, you still got a high-velocity metal projectile penetrating and traveling through your brain tissue. But what an impact like this also causes is a wave of pressure to be transmitted through that brain tissue. The resultant damage from this pressure wave, as well as the bleeding, can cause the brain to swell, leading to a TBI and death. There's another type of injury that can also occur when being shot, and that's caused by the shock waves of the bullet's impact. Any tissue surrounding the bullet as it travels on its path can be caught up in a temporary vacuum created by the high speed and the velocity of the projectile. This vacuum can be 40 times the size of the actual bullet itself, warping and stretching any tissue caught in its path. As the bullet burrows deep or passes clean through, it rips apart tissue, bursts blood vessels, and unleashes a surge of pressure inside your skull. But there's also shock waves that are coming off the bullet. They ripple outward from the bullet's path like waves across a pond, distorting and stretching brain matter in every direction. And if that wasn't bad enough, some bullets can fragment on impact. This causes small, sharp pieces of metal to become lodged throughout any tissue the bullet passes through. The severity of an injury and the extent of the damage left by a gunshot wound to the head can vary depending on the location. If the bullet passes through the tip of your right frontal lobe, just behind the forehead, and avoids the base of the skull, you might actually be lucky. That's because this area doesn't house as many vital brain functions or major blood vessels as the deeper regions. But that still doesn't guarantee you'd survive the injury inflicted. If a bullet enters through the tip of your left frontal lobe and travels downward toward the temporal lobe and brainstem, well then that's a different story. It would be traveling through some of the most vital tissue inside of your head. That's more likely to be lights out permanently. The same goes for if a bullet's trajectory went through any of the key blood vessels in your brain. This could result in a blood clot, which would rapidly expand, compressing the vital tissues of your brain. If that happens, you're either dead on the scene or battling against more of that rapidly increasing pressure inside of your skull. Whichever way you slice it, it's not looking good. If the bullet didn't directly penetrate your vital brain tissue shortly after impact, then any of the resultant injuries will likely finish you off, unless you just happen to be extremely lucky. Remember how we mentioned some gunshot victims survived their initial wound? Well, one of those was 14-year-old Ahad Israfil, who was shot in the head as a result of a freak accident. In 1987, while at work, Ahad's employer allegedly knocked a firearm onto the floor, which caused the weapon to discharge. The bullet struck Ahad in the head, destroying much of his brain tissue, in particular his right cerebral hemisphere, along with the right half of his skull. He was immediately rushed to the hospital, where intensive care surgeons tried to save his life. To their amazement, after 5 hours, Ahad had regained consciousness and tried to speak. The skin covering Ahad's scalp actually survived the injury, and plastic surgeons were able to use a silicone implant to fill the resultant hole in his skull, where the right half of his brain had been. The skin was then stretched over this implant to give Ahad more of a natural appearance. The repairs to his scalp meant that he could even regrow his hair. But if you're thinking that Ahad lived a difficult life missing half of his brain, think again. When a bullet damages someone's right hemisphere, this can leave the victim with motor and sensory impairments on the left side of their body and vice versa. Functions like thought, memory, speech, and vision are controlled by both sides of the brain working in tandem. So damaging one hemisphere can mean that someone is still able to perform some of those functions, more often in a limited capacity. Incredibly though, Ahad Israfil not only regained most of his mental faculties and was able to speak, he even successfully obtained an honors degree from his local university. He lived a long life afterward, eventually passing away in an Ohio nursing home back in 2019, over 30 years after surviving his traumatic brain injury. He's a pretty remarkable story and a great example of the human brain's capacity to recover even from severe injuries. But if we were in your shoes, we wouldn't exactly put all our chips on miraculously getting better after being shot in the head. You need a lot of things on the bingo card in order to survive a wound like that. But hey, maybe you get lucky. So long as the bullet entry point and exit wounds aren't too severe and the bullet misses the critical areas of the brain, it also needs to be a low-caliber round fired from a lower-velocity weapon, and the shooter can't be too close. You would also need immediate high-quality medical treatment Be in good health, not too old, no major medical conditions, and your blood pressure should be stable, and you don't end up with one of those several possible resultant internal injuries from the gunshot, and then maybe survival would be in the cards for you. Now go check out what happens when you die, or click on this video instead.